Hello and welcome back to this next video of the KNX IP video series. In the last video we got to know what the KNX IP multi-IO is. And in this video we want to take a look at how we can implement such an KNX IP only device into a KNX project and how we can give it an IP address. I am back here in the EDS6 and I have already prepared an example project for the multi-IO and the demo board. In the demo board we have two KNX twisted pair lines, but we will only use one of them, and this twisted pair line consists of a Match 55 push button sensor as well as a KNX IP router 752 secure. What we want to achieve is that with the push button sensor, with the left side of it, we can switch the switching output of the multi-IO, so the extension module 590. And with the right side of the push button sensor, we want to move the blinds, so the extension module 592 of the multi-IO. But before we can do that, we first of all have to insert the KNX IP multi-IO into our project. Therefore, I will change here to the catalogs page, and there I will search for the multi-IO IP, which you can see here, the KNX IP multi-IO 580. And I will drag and drop it into my IP area. And this is important because we can't insert it into our twisted pair line as the medium type of the multi-IO is IP. So if I wanted to do that and insert it in the twisted pair line, you can see we have an error, the validation failed due to the incompatibility of the medium types. So now that the multi-IO is inserted into our project, I will change back to the group addresses and let us take a look at the parameters of the multi-IO. So first of all, we have a little description page, and after that we have the general settings. Under the general settings we can specify options, for example, like the manual operation of the device. As the multi-IO has a display, we can enable or disable the manual operation, and we can also specify a time limit for the manual operation. Below that we have a telegram rate limitation, so here we can specify the maximum of telegrams sent within 10 seconds. If the multi-IO has to send more than this limitation, it will keep the telegrams, but it will wait so that the limit is adhered to. Below that we have three additional settings. First of all, the heartbeat setting. The heartbeat is a group object which will be generated if we activate it, and the heartbeat sends a telegram when the multi-IO is capable of receiving and sending telegrams, so when it is able to work properly. Below that, the display synchronization is also a group object which will be generated if we activate it, and the display synchronization sends a telegram whenever somebody uses the display of the multi-IO. Next to it we can enable or disable the option to reset the device via the display so that no one can reset it. And below that we have the long button press, so with this time we define when a button press is recorded as a long button press for the sake of a binary input. So that's the general settings. Below that we have the channel settings. I will skip them for now. And after that we have 16 logic/timer functions which we can enable or disable. So for example, function 1, I can say I want to have a timer function or a logic function. In the case of a logic function, we can specify different gate types. And if we take a look at the group objects, we can see we have two inputs, one output, which is parameterized as an AND gate. And this logical function is completely separated from the multi-IO in and outputs itself. So we can use it with inputs and outputs from the multi-IO, but we don't have to. We can also use it for external devices that don't have a logic function. So that's that. We can also enable a timer function, which is just a switch on delay which can be specified to a switch on or off delay, and also a staircase, so an impulse function. And again with that, this logical function, or this time function in this case now, is completely separated from the multi-IO, so we can use it for the multi-IO, but we can also use it for external devices. So that's the logic and timer function. I will disable the function for now. And before we take a look at the channel functions and enable switching, blind functionality and a binary input, I first of all want to give the multi-IO its physical address, so I want to connect to the KNX IP multi-IO with the EDS6. And therefore the multi-IO has to get an IP address. The first option is that the addressing is achieved via a DHCP server. This means that after starting the multi-IO, it will automatically check if there is a DHCP server available. If this is the case, well then the multi-IO assigns the IP address which was given by the DHCP server. But what is if we don't have a DHCP server in our network? The second option is to address the multi-IO via the EDS6. This means that in the EDS6 there can be specified which IP address the multi-IO should have. And then, after downloading it to the multi-IO, it assigns this IP address. But also here, one requirement is necessary, because in order to download those informations onto the multi-IO as a connection, there has to be used KNX IP routing. And the EDS6 only gives this option to use KNX IP routing if it has already detected a KNX IP device, like an IP router, in the same network. But what is if this also isn't the case, because for example the KNX IP router at the moment isn't programmed? Well then the third option always can be used, because there isn't any requirement to address the multi-IO via the display. And at the second and the third option we want to take a look at now. So let's take a look at the second option, to give the multi-IO its IP address via the EDS6. Therefore, I simply go to the properties, and there under IP, you can see currently there is set that the IP address should be assigned automatically, which means via DHCP. But what I want to do now is I want to use a static IP address. And there I can set up the IP address the multi-IO should have. Then I also have to change the subband mask, so that it is the same as my network. And now with that finished, I can download those informations onto the multi-IO. And in order to do that, I open up the connection page. And there you can see there are two options available. The first of it is the KNX IP router 752 secure, which means that we would use the tunneling interface that this router provides. And the second option is the network card of my PC. And this means that the EDS6 will use KNX IP instead of KNX IP tunneling. And in order to download everything onto the multi-IO, I have to use KNX IP as my network connection. So therefore I will use the network card. Now that I have set up my connection, I can download everything onto the multi-IO. So download all. And now I have to press the programming button. So now the download is finished and the multi-IO has its IP address. We can also check this if we ping this IP address and see if we get an answer. Therefore I will open up the command line, and there I simply type ping and then the IP address which I just assigned. And as you can see, we get a response by the KNX IP multi-IO. So this is how you set up the IP address via the EDS6. Now I want to take a look at the third option, when there isn't this network connection available. So therefore I will quickly reset the multi-IO to factory settings, as well as the settings I just changed in the EDS6. So to give the multi-IO now an IP address, I can immediately go to the display and set it up there. So to do that, we go down in the menu to IP configuration, and there I can now specify either if I want to have a DHCP address, or what I will do now, I will specify a static IP address. So now that this is done, I also want to change the IP settings within the EDR6. So therefore, I open up the IP tab in the EDR6, and there I also specify that I want to use a static IP address and the same address which I used in the display, and also changing the subnet mask. Now that this is done, we can start to download the physical address. Therefore, I open up the connection manager in the EDR6, and now it is important that you don't use the tunneling addresses. So not the KNX IP router 752, I have 2 of them, but instead the Ethernet card. Because if we would use a tunnel, we could only connect to the twisted pair devices behind the IP router, because we use tunneling. With the network card, we won't use KNX IP tunneling, but instead KNX IP, and then we are also able to communicate with devices that are only connected via KNX IP. So bear in mind that if you want to communicate to a KNX IP device, you have to use the network card, not the tunneling gateway. So now that this is all done properly, we can start to download everything onto the device. So download all, and now I have to press the programming button. So now the KNX IP multi-IO has its physical address as well as the IP address, and therefore in the next video we can start to implement the switching functionality. So that's that for this video.